When should you diet or cut if you have performance training goals? Hello there, my friends, and welcome back to my YouTube channel / The Messy Middle podcast. I'm Dr. Alyssa Olenick. If you're new here and if you're returning, hello and welcome back. Make sure you hit subscribe if you're new here so you don't miss any of the future fun, education, or science or learning. And otherwise, let's dive into today's episode. So, the age-old question that we see all the time I get with clients or on Instagram or social media is, when should I diet, or how should I approach dieting or fat loss when I have performance training goals? So if you haven't yet, I encourage you to go back and listen to or watch my podcast episode, Performance versus Aesthetics. I think that unpacks a lot of this. And I also have an episode coming out either before or after this episode here, talking about how to kind of prevent, quote unquote, or why people tend to gain weight when race training, and my advice for that. So this today is going to be more of a conversation around, when should you actually approach having a dieting season or a cut, or actually trying to pursue intentional weight loss. So before we dive into the conversation here today, the reason I'm having these conversations on the YouTube / podcast versus Instagram is because I know that these conversations aren't for everyone. I know not everyone likes to talk or is in a position to think about, or it's healthy for them to pursue intentional weight loss. So I want to make sure I have these conversations in a place where you can opt out of them if it isn't for you. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with my platform, I tend to keep my content more focused on performance and training and athletic and endeavors for performance-based goals. However, I have a PhD in exercise physiology and energy metabolism, and my dissertation work and master's work is actually in fat metabolism. I just never really talk about these things simply because I love a performance-based focused training goal. However, I think that there's so much of a want and need for information around this that is credible, science-based, and or, is helpful, and isn't just so much of the scammy stuff out there. And I know for our clients or people who follow me, like, that's something that you want and need, and you're either afraid to ask for, or you are seeking it out from predatory sources and not getting the information you need. So I'm kind of stepping in this year and talking about this conversation a little bit more, some nuance, and hopefully a little bit more delicately, to actually help you along the way. And so we recently partnered the Lyss method, my training programs, with Heart House Nutrition as well. And me and my friend Sarah talk about these things a lot because they have a great behavior-based change and evidence-based way of approaching nutrition goals. And neither of us are anti-dieting, but we're definitely anti the crappy dieting advice that is out there. And there's such a difference. And I think that for so many of you guys here, you've likely fallen prey to a lot of that predatory, bad, misinformation filled, crappy dieting advice. And so I am not here to say that weight loss is bad or shame you if you desire that. But what I think is important before we dive into this conversation is for those of you listening to this to really filter out if you are somebody who truly does need like a phase of intentional weight loss, or a dieting period, or a specific, diet approach, time plan, or whatever that is. Or if you're somebody who is kind of on the leaner end of the spectrum, you might identify as quote unquote skinny fat, you kind of lack muscle tissue or muscle density, you don't really resistance train, and or you feel like you don't have like an athletic training body. And if a diet or cut or more of an energy deficit is the answer to what you're actually looking for, or if a long period of time of not dieting and focusing on eating enough protein, training for performance, and building muscle and training for strength performance, muscle hypertrophy, and or body recomposition is actually more of the choice for you. I think for so many people, specifically women or endurance athletes, they tend to err on the side of like, well, I should be thinner, smaller, eat less, restrict, rather than, hey, I actually need to be eating more and focusing more on performance and or lifting, gaining muscle, training for power and strength, and having a year or a long period of time not actually focusing on dieting and weight loss. And so that's like, I'm going to crack this open with that for some of you, you might need to do like a deficit or cut or something in the future, if you want to call it whatever that is, at some point in time, but it's going to be really hard for you to kind of get that body type or look or shape that you are looking for if you don't have the structure and muscle and build underneath whatever you're trying to lose or cut back to kind of get you to where you would be. And that applies for everyone, right? Like even if someone has more body fat to lose, if they don't have a lot of muscle or, that body built underneath it of what they're looking for, you're not going to like, you can lose a ton of weight and not really still have the look that you're looking for. I think everyone should pursue strength training, enough protein intake, eating in a way that supports and preserves muscle. But there's those people who are in the leaner, thinner, typically more average or normal end of the spectrum here. I'm trying to use words very delicately, so don't mind me, who they don't need a period of true like weight loss or fat loss. They actually need to just like work on dialing in their nutrition, better, more structured eating, and or increasing protein intake and making sure they're pairing their endurance training with enough strength training or having a strength training season with that. Or general regular people might have performance goals who've never really spent a time invested on strength or muscle building on top of the other goals that they have. And so really right now, kind of filtering that out for yourself is like, do I really need another diet, or do I need to not diet and actually spend some time learning how to eat more regularly and or increasing protein intake and or actually building muscle tissue? And that would be the thing that gets you to that. And sometimes you need a coach that gives you that tough love, honest approach, and or, somebody to kind of put you in line on that there. And that can be more helpful, than just always spinning the wheel and cutting forever. There's also the people who have been literally chronically dieting, yo-yo dieting for years. And they're thinking, okay, well, this podcast episode will tell me the thing to do. And my advice is going to be similar in that if you've been just yo-yo dieting, trying every trend, every diet, and or applying those to performance goals, like spend a period of time, regardless of your body composition or size, just like figuring out how to eat more normally. That Sarah calls it being a normal eater. And you can look at Heart House Nutrition for more information on that. And, just learning how to eat in a way that supports you, improves your dietary composition, increasing fibers, plants, vegetables, increasing the quality of your foods, reducing hyper processed foods or, extremely processed foods, increasing, the protein intake of your diet, kind of dialing in these little behavior changes that allow you to eat a better, more nutritious diet or more regular meal patterns, like actually eating lunch or, cutting back on the random snacks that you eat at the office, like those little types of things that will help support healthy, normal eating before you dive into a dieting phase or a cut period or whatever that looks like. You might not have the tools you need to even be successful with that. And so you can build muscle and train hard while navigating these things, but I need to take a break from the dieting before doing that. And then in the third, bypassing my disclaimers of people here who this might not be the advice that you need right now, is the people who've, you've kind of, you've been overeating, or you know that you have true body weight loss, weight to lose or fat to lose or whatever that looks like for you, or you haven't been doing this yo-yo dieting thing or under eating or lying to yourself about needing to gain muscle, and that weight loss or fat loss is truly a goal that you have that's in alignment with what you want, makes sense for you, and you have a good mental clarity around it. Again, I'm trying to make sure these messages land in a way that aren't hurtful or harmful or promoting like disordered eating of any sort with anyone who has a negative relationship with those things. And so for those people who truly have that, regardless of where you're at in the spectrum of this, you have the right to want to lose weight or have body recomposition, no matter how lean or how much adiposity you have. It's not like there's a parameter here of people who qualify to do this, but you're someone who's just kind of been regular for a while wherever you're at, and you want to, dial it in, tighten it up, lose some true weight, whatever that looks like. And you also love to train for races, events, you're hybrid training, you have strength competitions, like whatever that looks like for whatever you're doing, and you have performance goals. Most people in my audience here are training for races, high roxes, some sort of hybrid endurance type training or events. And you want to know when is the best time to do this? What's the best way to approach this? And so if you've been around the streets with me a little bit here, you know that I am of the approach of do not use a race as a diet plan. Like your race training, your race event, whatever you're training for, that is not your diet plan. That is not the time to diet. That's not the time to cut. I just don't think that is, unless you're kind of going through the motions and you're training for something at a volume that you're accustomed to and you're not really increasing intensity or volume in response to a big training cycle for that goal. Let's not do this thing where we're trying to cut while also training for a race. You're going to burn the candle at both ends. For a lot of women, this might overstress your body and your hormones or backfire, or it's just not the time to do that, or immediately after you finish a race. Like if you just finished training for a race, you ran the race, like don't start your diet the Monday after the race. Like give yourself a few weeks to also recover. But there's a few periods of time that I think are great for people who have performance goals that either involve cutting back your training or kind of maintaining your training within that. So I think that the best way to approach this is one, during your off season where your training volume is lower, maybe your strength training's higher, you're cross training more, you're just overall hours intensity volume is pulled back, and using that as an intentional period of time to have a structured and like get in and get out type deficit. I think that that's the best way to go into this. Is just like, hey, I'm going to get in and get this done, so you don't have to spend an extended period of time across your entire year like constantly in a deficit. Get in, get out, treat it like a dieting phase. Maybe you're pulling back your intensity and volume in your endurance training in order to make space for that energy deficit that you're having, and or you're just pulling back intensity and maintaining lower intensity but similar volume while you're doing this, or you're just like your overall training volume is lower because you're not peaking and prepping for a race, and kind of actually setting that as a period of time goal. I'm big on training seasons, and this is a season where you might dedicate, maybe 6, 8, 12 weeks, however long you are navigating that with a coach or yourself, or deciding, it is time for that. I don't think there's like a specific structured time cap on deficits. It's just going to depend on someone's goals, their body's responses, or what's kind of necessary for that. And get in and get out, get it done. Treat it as an off-season goal. Treat it as, when you're running and training volume or whatever it is more maintained or lower or cut back, and get in and make that the specific goal of that period of time. So you're kind of more so maintaining your fitness. You're not really trying to build anything or using it as an off-season type goal. Again, once you're through recovery, I think that's a good period of time to have a specific fat loss goal. Or I think the off-season, or a period of time where you're not intentionally training for a race or event, is a great time period to focus on like building muscle, improving body composition, and or going all in on actually like focusing on strength training over endurance training goals if you're someone who tends to favor that, and actually build some muscle. I mean, muscle is the biggest contributor to our resting energy metabolism. And even though gaining muscle pound by pound doesn't add a ton of calories to our resting energy expenditure every day, muscle is costly to have. It's costly to build. It's costly to recover. It's costly to maintain from a metabolic and energetic standpoint. And so having a period of time where you are dedicated to potentially maybe not eating in a super steep deficit, but maintaining and building muscle, allowing your body to recomp, could be a great period of time here as well. Or if you're someone who falls in that bucket of that first person I was talking about, kind of doing this, but like with the intention of actually building muscle and or gaining mass from a muscle standpoint and recomping during this period of time, which might be a little bit slower or might include maybe sometimes even like a slight surplus or your upper end of maintenance, so to speak, for some of you guys, and just like really dedicating a period of time. The disclaimer on this is that this is going to be more of like a 6 to 12 month goal. I have a podcast episode on strength seasons. Unfortunately, the video didn't work, so it's not on YouTube if you're coming from YouTube, but it's from a year or so ago, talking about strength seasons and how to approach those. I would go back and listen to that, because that kind of advice will apply here, and actually just using it as a period of time to truly like improve body recomposition or recomping. So decreasing fat and increasing muscle, which a lot of people can do with adequate protein intake and strength training. To some degree, for most people, you can be relatively successful with that. If you're not in a super extreme deficit, you're going to probably be able to do that relatively well for at least a good period of time. Some people do need an extra boost in calories to really bump up that muscle, depending on where they're at or their training age or how long they've been training for, and or just eating at a higher end of maintenance or things like that. Some people can do this while being in a slight deficit. Again, this is generalized advice for the lay public here, so it's hard to say exactly like what the exact protocol is for you. But, treating it as more of like a maintenance season where you're increasing protein intake, training really hard in the gym, gaining muscle, and recomping your body is also a great period of time. But recognizing like that might be a longer period of time than maybe just like a month or two. Usually, if you're going to do this and invest in this, like at least 3 to 6 months would be kind of the minimum there that I would set this at during this period of time, and actually investing in on that. And then you might be pulling back the running training or endurance training or cardio training volume while focusing on this specifically. And so the next thing that I really love for a period of time to focus on body recomposition or fat loss is going to be in base build or like a maintenance running season. So in the Lyss method, we have these things called base build or off build seasons. And I talk about this a little bit more in my performance versus aesthetics podcast, because I did a very small cut in the spring of 2023. And it really was only like maybe 5-7 pounds, take my personal fluctuations within my body composition. But I intentionally ate a little bit more in the winter between, some fall races and then training for my return to ultra 50 miler, which I document that whole thing on YouTube. And so I intentionally ate a little bit extra while I was increasing strength in that over the winter. And so then I just kind of titrated back my nutrition a little bit that spring, probably pulling back that, that extra weight that I intentionally gained while gaining muscle and strength back over that winter strength approach season. And so I think from the period of like March through the end of May is how I approach this. And when I say that I lost like the slowest rate of fat loss you'll have ever seen in your entire life during this period of time, but I was in a base build phase. So I was running essentially the same amount of miles every single week during this period of time. I was building base for my 50-miler training goal that later that year, training for some fun objective things. I did the Boulder Skyline Traverse. I had my long runs on the weekends. So I took this like very, very, very gradual and slow. And keeping in mind that I'm someone who is on like the more leaner end of the spectrum, I typically sit between 18 and 22% body fat. So I'm not someone who's usually like, I think then I did a DEXA, I was like 23% body fat at that period of time. So I wasn't taking this super aggressive. I also had performance and training goals, but my running mileage was maintained. So I think I was doing probably around 25 to 35 miles a week at this point in time, somewhere in that range. I was still strength training like 3 days a week consistently. And so I used that as a period of time to do this super, super, super gradual fat loss phase. And all I essentially did was kind of what I like to call just like dialing in your nutrition. I didn't take this super aggressive approach, this super big slash of calories, but essentially what I did, because I was building my base, I still had, I was trying to gain fitness and performance during this time, is keeping my protein high, keeping my calories kind of at maintenance or that slightly lower end of maintenance, like a very, very, very tiny deficit. I think I lost, I want to say like 3 to 5 pounds over, I don't even think it was 5 pounds. I want to say it was like 3 pounds, which I'm 5'1" and my ribs and hips touch. So that's kind of significant on me, over the course of like 6 to 8 weeks. Like it was super, super slow, maybe 4 pounds max. And so it was very, very gradual. But the idea was that I was doing it in a way that it was so subtle that I was still able to eat to kind of support my performance and training. But the reason I recommend this during a base build or a maintenance period is that you are not increasing your intensity or your volume. So what you're doing is that the variable that you are adding more stress to your body with then is the slight energy deficit of the nutrition that you're bringing in. So because you are adapted to that volume that you're doing or the intensity that you're doing, if you're training is relatively stable or maintained, that is where I think, people get into this trickery of they're increasing their intensity or their volume of their training. They're either adding lifting volume or lifting days, they're adding mileage, they're adding more speed work, and then they're also complementing that with an energy deficit. And then you kind of end up burning the candle at both ends, feeling horrific. You are not recovering, you're not performing well. And I think the reason that backfires is because people think, well, I'm just going to add all the things to all the things because I'm going to make an energy deficit with my training while adding it and compounding it with this energy deficit. And then you just like completely backfires. So the reason I like doing this during these like base build or maintenance or off-season phases where you're kind of maintaining volume is like your body's adapted to that stress of your training and you're still accumulating benefit from that and you're adapting and improving in response to that. But your body isn't having like this added or extra stress more than what's already adapted to or conditioned to respond to. And so that's why I like those for deficit phases. Now, I don't think like an aggressive deficit is appropriate here. Like if you're going to do an aggressive deficit, do it in the off season, do it on its own, do it as its own specific thing. But very gradual deficits and or like recomposition type phases, I think go really well in here. And that's great because that gives you time to do this while you're still kind of base building. You're not really in specific training mode. You're not in this specific period of time where like you're really dialing in training to peak for a race, but it's kind of that base build period, which I'm a big fan of like long base builds. Honestly, in general, for so many people, I think people really underestimate that. I think the base build is just a great period of time for maintaining running volume and gaining a ton of fitness from just like a higher level of aerobic easy training. It's a great time to push strength. If you're trying to get stronger or gain muscle while also maintaining a relatively higher training volume for running, or do deficits during that period of time, very cute, very, very mild ones, like lower end of your maintenance spectrum, like not super crazy aggressive, taking it super slow, which I know people don't like that. If you want to get in and get out and do an extreme deficit, do that on its own. But if you want this gradual kind of recomposition approach with training, leaning out a little bit while also respecting your training and your performing demands and needs, I like doing this here because you're just like tightening things up a little bit, dialing things in, being a little bit more specific and narrow with the way you're eating, keeping that protein high. And honestly, I think for so many people, like it doesn't even need to be a deficit as much as it needs to be like if you're tracking calories, like just being more dialed in and specific with your nutrition. I think a lot of people like you're so unaware of how much you're actually eating or what you're eating, and just like increasing this awareness, I think sometimes can be enough for some people, just depending on your dieting history and or your eating history in the past, and just kind of dialing in your nutrition. I find for me, I think that's a big reason why I always tend to lean out a little bit when I'm race training. And I think a big reason is that I'm just more dialed in with my nutrition. I'm eating more, I'm eating a lot. I'm not really restricting my food, but I end up kind of recomping, one, from the volume of endurance training alone, but two, I'm just being more dialed in with my nutrition. I think that itself like accounts for like the excess food you don't realize you're eating with like eating out all the time, or, you know, grazing or other snacks, or when you're not really paying attention. And again, it's not to say any of those things are inherently bad. But the point of all this is like, I think this is a great period of time to just kind of like dial in that nutrition, keep focusing on your training, really focusing on performance, but just kind of keeping it a little bit tighter on the lower end of that. Again, this isn't an extreme restrictive diet or deficit or big cut. It's really just like kind of eating at maintenance, but slightly kind of less or the lower end of that for a slight period of time, and having a very, very, very gradual kind of recomp based approach. I think this approach works really well for people too who maybe are on that leaner end of that spectrum, or trying to recomp a little bit within their performance of their training without it really affecting them in a negative way. Or people who do want to continue kind of a little bit of a fat loss or true diet phase while also having these performance goals on the horizon they want to train for. We don't want you to go into a diet phase, completely neglect running or training at all if you have a race or event, or lifting, you know, if you have some sort of performance competition there, and then be like, oh, now I need to go into a training cycle, and you have no base built. You still want to be maintaining training or running, but the idea is that you're either pulling it back or you're just maintaining at a recoverable and maintainable volume before then kind of shifting gears into that performance focus. I'm race training. This is the peak phase. This is the prep phase. This is the 2 to 3 months where I'm really intentionally dialed in on focused on building my mileage, volume, and intensity into that race goal before my taper, because I'm really not giving you the advice of maintaining this or doing this. Like once you are in that, you know, 8 to 12 weeks of like really building up that intensity and volume for a big specific goal, or in the taper, that's when this ends. Like you're back to higher volume eating, you're eating more, you're eating at the higher end of maintenance, you're increasing your intake on your higher volume days, your carb intake's going up, your calorie intake's going up, but it's still within your relative maintenance, but you're eating at a true maintenance or the middle to upper end of your maintenance. Like you are not trying to be in a deficit, you're not trying to cut, you're not really trying to have massive body weight fluctuations, or, you know, your body weight get really low in response to this. I'm usually of the advice that if your body weight starts to rapidly drop while you are in that peak or prep phase of trainings, like you need to be eating a little bit more or maintaining a little bit of a higher calorie intake. Once you kind of see that, like I see like a gradual kind of drop in steady plateau. And then once I'm in that plateau, I'm good. But when I start to drop more below that, then I realize, hey, I got to bring that back up within my training, which I know seems so counter to so many people. But if you have performance goals, you need to eat in a way that supports your performance goals. So like when you are trying to dial it in and keep it tighter, and, or, you know, be in a cut or a deficit or have some intentional fat loss there, yes, we need to be a little bit smart about that. But when you're training to perform, you are eating to perform, and you are switching that mindset like once you're through that phase of time. But the great thing about like that base build period is that you can kind of indefinitely be in there for a while. It does prolong deficits or fat loss or recomposition. But I think it's a great period of time where your body can maintain your lifting volume with your running volume in a way that is just like recoverable and easy to do to begin with. So you can favor hypertrophy and strength a little bit more in there too. And you can just like dial in your nutrition a little bit to let your body slowly recomp while you are still kind of building that base for these future training goals that you have. And so, you know, the idea is that you're not really pushing volume intensity or training stuff a ton here. You're just kind of in this like maintenance zone of things while you're slightly recomping and training. That doesn't mean you still can't perform or train hard. You can, especially because you won't be eating at such a low limit that it's going to like super negatively impact performance. And then I will give the disclaimer in with all these things that I find sometimes though, I can really use my recovery to kind of see where I'm at with these things. And if I feel like I'm really, really under recovered, poor recovery multiple days in a row, I'm not recovering from the things, I might need to bump up what I'm actually eating. And or just kind of having like from taking this from like the bodybuilder cultures, like a refeed day, like just a higher calorie day, or like maybe 1 or 2 days a week where I'm not in a deficit, I'm more at maintenance or higher maintenance. Maybe that's on my long run days, maybe that's on my double days. So you're not kind of in this mindset of like, I'm in a deficit every single day of the week, but maybe like I'm in a net deficit across the week, or like 5 out of 7 days in the week, I'm in a slight deficit. But on these days where like I have really high training volume or performance needs or recovery needs are high, like, hey, I'm eating at calorie intake. And I usually take that approach typically like on long run days. Like I won't, you know, if I'm ever doing this, like long run day, you're kind of eating at or at maintenance or slightly above, or maybe sometimes a little bit extra to make sure I'm supporting recovery. Same with double days. So it is a slower approach to a deficit or dieting, but I think it's a more sustainable, gradual approach for those who want that with performance goals and aren't opting for the like, hey, I'm taking a specific period of time to pull back from these race training performance goals and maintaining at a lower volume or a lower range of whatever I'm doing, mileage, lifting, intensity, whatever that duration, and like really making the diet or the deficit my main priority. And so the goal here is, if you have true fat loss goals or body recomposition goals, it's like, one, identify what camp you kind of belong to that I kind of identified here of like the 2 or 3 different kind of characteristics of people. Be honest with yourself, and if you really need to just be gaining muscle, if you need kind of a slow recomp, or if you need to just kind of take a season of like getting in, getting it done, getting it out, and then, you know, maybe you're not then dieting until you finish that race training goal and go up back into another diet cycle in the future, or planning your diet before your big build or your big peak or whatever that looks like here, and making sure that like you aren't listening to this podcast and self-identifying as someone who needs to go in these extreme deficits, and you don't. You really need to be eating more to fuel and perform and focus on muscle and recovery, and or, you know, being intentional about the periods of time that you're doing this. Low energy availability is something that is a huge risk for females, especially. We are a lot more sensitive to energy deficits than males, but men are not, you know, immune to this as well. I know I have a mix of female and male listeners, so it's just they can get away with more energy deficits before things start to go haywire or impact them hormonally or negatively. But we want to make sure that we are eating enough. We're not going below those thresholds, so you can kind of calculate that as like 40 to 45 grams per kilogram of lean mass or fat-free mass. Not a lot of people have DEXAs, or it's not perfect because we all don't know our body composition, but like you kind of don't want to go below that threshold for like a very long, aggressive period of time. There is a difference between an acute energy deficit or low energy availability versus chronic, but really we like don't want to spend long periods of time in these extreme aggressive deficits, especially if we have high performance goals, high volume of training or performance and all that stuff. So I don't want you guys to take this episode of me being like, endurance athletes should be on a diet, because this message and this information here is more so for gen pop people who recreationally run than like lean, fit endurance athletes who do not need to be dieting. They need to either be eating more, eating enough, or maybe gaining weight to restore periods and or menstrual cycles. So if you are one of those people who is more of a higher volume endurance junkie runner, you are leaner by nature, you have menstrual cycle dysfunction, you struggle with bone stress fractures, you sit too lean naturally, and you think, oh, I need to be leaner, like maybe this advice isn't for you, and you need to be focusing more on eating and potentially, you know, gaining weight or, you know, getting your menstrual cycle back and things like that. So we do have to be careful here. Like you want to make sure that you aren't overstressing your body with deficits while also matching them with performance and training goals. And if you notice here, I'm usually recommending that you're either maintaining or pulling back your training volume, which endurance just adds a lot of training volume stress and energy deficits on our body than like strength training does. But you also don't want to be overly strength training, or like cross conditioning, like, you know, your CrossFit high roxy type stuff too. I think a lot of this stuff is becoming really trendy with the running and the high rocks, and, you know, everyone wants to look lean and good while we're doing it. And I think that, you know, making sure you focus on building muscle is probably the first thing, but you do have to, you know, to be toned or lean, there is a layer of fat that we need to cut back on to some degree. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we need to be strategic and smart about the way that we're doing that. And for many of us, you might still look like you're eating a lot more than you think you need because you have a performance training goal or performance training volumes while being in conjunction with that, or like that's just not right for you. A deficit or a diet or being, you know, any more restrictive is not the answer for what you need. And it might be something beyond the scope of this podcast here that you need to address from a nutritional standpoint or a just, you know, food relationship standpoint here today. So just making sure that like you're being safe and smart with this advice on how it applies to you and not, you know, putting your body in too big of a stress deficit or energy deficit. We want to make sure that we are still fueling and supporting what we're doing, especially females who are more sensitive to these things. So there's like my big disclaimer there on low energy availability, over restricting, and all of that. So really identify like the advice that you need, the guidance that you need, who of these examples most applies to you and, you know, your situation. And, or I really like using the Macro Factor app for tracking food. I think it does a great job of like estimating energy expenditure and tracking weight trends over time. If you're someone who can track food and or body weight and feel pretty neutral about that, I am very logical and data driven, so I don't have a lot of head game about it. And I can kind of see when I'm like trends over time, or I'm overly restricting, or kind of like the gradual changes of things over time and looking at that trend long time, but also like my energy expenditure. And so I can kind of see when it's estimating that my body is burning more, needing more calories, and adjust for that appropriately. They have an AI-based coach built in I've never used before. Not sponsored. They did give me a free subscription like 4 or 5 years ago, and I've used it ever since. I absolutely love that app. Changed the game for tracking for me. Honestly, I used to hate it before I used it. But, if you're not going to use a coach, I think apps like that are great. I also have a macro calculator that I can link here in the show notes or the YouTube notes below that can kind of help you estimate and calculate these things for yourself as a starting point, or my fast and fed mini guide, which can give you some guidance about setting up your nutrition to support for performance and or your performance-based training goals and needs. So if you guys found this helpful, let me know. Rate, review on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube. Share this with someone that was helpful. But if you're on the YouTube, leave a comment here and let me know if you have any questions that you'd like me to cover in a follow-up episode, something that you found helpful, and or anything like that. And otherwise, thank you guys for being here. I will catch you on the next one.